We might not notice, but tremendous technology and mind-boggling science constantly surround us in the products we use every day. Behind their practical use lurk hidden histories, dramatic discoveries, and awesome experiments. They are Wicked Inventions. Coming up, cider. What is the connection between Rome and this fizzy apple favourite? Guns. The science that explains why a spinning bullet is deadlier than a musket ball. Snowboard. Half pipes, wax and wood. We reveal the amazing manufacturing process behind this snow riding king. We reveal the surprising science and amazing manufacture behind these wicked inventions. Cider is an alcoholic drink made by the crushing or tight pressing of fruit, typically apples. But just how was cider introduced?
The very early origins of cider are not exactly known. Apple trees have obviously been grown across the world for many, many years. But actually, probably one of the earliest sort of developments, understandings of cider was when the Romans invaded Britain in 55 BC. And the Kentish people were already drinking cider even then. So how long they'd been drinking it before then, we don't know.
Not only is the invention of cider shrouded in mystery, it is also unclear as to how the first types of cider were actually made. The process would have involved the crushing of fruit into some form of liquid and then formed with other juices. This method may sound easy, but there are various hygiene problems throughout.
Up to the 17th century, it's said that almost every farm would have had a cider press. So there were apple trees, apple orchards everywhere. And it's important to note that actually the apples you use for cider were different from eating apples or cooking apples.
These apples are often cultivated for cider use. In comparison to the apples you'd typically buy from the supermarket, these cider apples contain higher levels of acid and sugar.
Through the medieval period, after the Norman conquest, people continued to drink cider. But it was interesting that a lot of farmers, they actually gave their workers cider as a part of their wage.
Despite many accepting this wage, after a campaign to stop cider payment in 1887 was successful, we saw a rapid decline in the use and creation of cider, purely because its primary use was no longer needed.
But what's interesting is, in more recent times, the 21st century, there's been a revival, and actually there's a lot of small breweries who are now creating their own new ciders.
Today, modern cider making still relies on the same basic principles that have applied for centuries. A fine example of this would be Western cider, but just how do they make their appley drink? Award-winning Western cider have been making cider since 1880, when Henry Weston first started the company. But what is the family connection involved in this process today?
H. Weston & Sons Limited is a cider company run by the Weston family. I'm the 5th generation cider maker of them, and I've been here 25 years. We make for ourselves about 30 to 40 different varieties of ciders and perries. So Henry Weston made cider back in the day the same as we do now. The only difference is that we have machinery which do a lot of it for us. But the process is still the same, and he maturated his ciders the same as we do here.
Cider apples are grown in both standard orchards and bush orchards. However, bush orchards like this one are now used most of the time, because they can be planted more densely and managed far more easily. Around August, the apples are ripe and ready to be harvested. Apples are shaken to the ground by a machine, then a tractor will travel up each row and collect the fallen apples. Some bushes are too young to be shaken, so these are picked by hand instead.
As soon as we pick the fruit, it is then taken up to our weighbridge. It is weighed off, where we take in roughly around 35,000 tonne of fruit a year, which will produce roughly around 25 millilitres of juice.
To cope with so many apples being delivered, the cider farm has extremely large pits to store them in. Lorries can arrive carrying as many as 28 metric tonnes of apples at a time. Gravity and flame water pulls the apples from the pits into underground channels, which lead to the washing area, where the apples are cleaned. It is also where the twigs, dirt and anything else picked up in the fields are removed, so that only pure apples move on to the next stage. It would take a huge amount of energy to press a whole apple, so in the milling area, the apples are smashed into a pulp. This is a thick mess of crushed apple that is full of juice, ready to be pressed. The press is filled with apple pulp, then spends a couple of hours squeezing the juice. It takes 90 minutes to press 10 tons of fruit. The press rotates continuously to make sure all the juice escapes, leaving only an apple pomace, which is bits of skin and stem that can't be used in the production of cider. These are collected at the end of the process, then sold as compost or food for farmyard animals. The apple juice is then tested in the laboratory to make sure it has no impurities and it meets all the standards required for fermentation. The juice is also tested for its acidity, specific gravity and of course taste. To make the apple juice alcoholic and truly a cider, it is held in stainless steel tanks to ferment. Sugar and yeast is added, which undergoes aerobic respiration, where the yeast breaks down the glucose which is within the sugar.
And from there we'll actually add oxygen to oxidize the juice to help the yeast work and give you a better alcohol.
This produces carbon dioxide, which is released, and ethanol, which is the alcohol. During fermentation, samples of the cider are tested in the lab to make sure only the right percentage of alcohol is achieved. Once the levels are correct, the cider is racked off the dead yeast and moved to another stainless steel tank or oak vat and left to mature for up to 18 months. Western Cider has two collections of oak vats. Some hold their organic ciders and are named after Henry Weston's daughters. The other is the largest collection of oak vats in the world and is used to hold their non-organic ciders. There are a wide variety of vats. Some are so big they could fit a bus inside and hold 340,000 pints of cider. The smallest are the 3 original vats that Henry Weston started with, just big enough for a man to stand inside of. If the cider makers are making a clear cider, then the liquid is pumped through a filter which removes any residual yeast, sugar or other bits. Other ciders do not undergo the filtering process and therefore keep their cloudy appearance. These ciders became better known as scrumpy ciders. Blending is next, where ingredients are added to turn the alcoholic apple juice into a specific cider. This takes a few hours whilst everything is mixed well before the cider is pumped into the production area. Here the cider is bottled or kegged for transportation to shops and pubs. New bottles are filled, whereas old kegs can be cleaned, sterilised, washed out and filled again. If a cider is carbonated, the gas is added just as the liquid is injected into the bottle or keg to make sure no gas escapes. All the kegs and bottles are then assembled in the dispatch yard, ready to be loaded onto delivery lorries, which take them to shops and pubs all around the world. Cider, truly a wicked invention. These are truly wicked inventions. It has been estimated that in America alone, there are over 270 million of them, and they were responsible for the deaths of nearly 33,000 people in 2011. They are guns. This destructive weapon originated in China in the 1200s and started to appear on the battlefields of continental Europe by the 14th century. Driven by gunpowder, these were called handguns and were literally a smaller version of a much larger cannon and operated in exactly the same way.
If we think of a cannon, which is a simple form of a gun, at one end you have gunpowder, some kind of material that will explode or react in a very fast manner and produce a lot of gas. In front of it you then have the cannonball, or some kind of projectile. That sits there and effectively blocks the open end of the tube. You have an expanding gas with something that blocks the end of the tube. This gas exerts a lot of force on the cannonball or the projectile, and at which point the only means for this to explode safely and not completely destroy itself is for that projectile to exit out of the long pipe that is the gun. What this means is that as long as the gun is aimed in the right direction, the projectile can go where it is desired.
Due to the poor quality of gunpowder that was often used and their crude construction, they were not very effective, as early examples often lacked sufficient power to punch through even the lightest of armour. Another major drawback was the fact that a stand was needed, as one hand had to ignite the gun while the other tried to aim. A technical solution to these limitations was the development of an increasingly explosive gunpowder and the adoption of a more efficient trigger system. A slow-burning cord held in place by a clamp moved down when pulled by a trigger. The burning cord or match touched and ignited a small charge in a flash pan, which in turn ignited the main charge, firing the weapon. Called the matchlock musket, by the mid-15th century it was starting to dominate the battlefields of Western Europe, but the accuracy of the musket left a lot to be desired. This is because once a projectile exited a musket's barrel, wind resistance and gravity would cause the ball or bullet to move about or tumble through the air, meaning it could veer off target after a relatively short distance, approximately 50 to 100 metres for a musket such as the 18th century British Brown Bess. A new concept called rifling increased these ranges threefold, and meant that rifles, as these guns were now known, could be far more effective on the battlefield.
Rifling is where you take the normally smooth bore and introduce grooves into the side of it. It's normally about 6, and they slowly turn from one end to the other end, so you actually infer a spinning on the particle that you're trying to eject. Now, if you infer a good spin on the particle or the projectile, what this means is the angular momentum allows it to stay straighter and truer and will tumble less. If it tumbles less, then it's a more accurate projectile, which means you can shoot something more accurately at over a longer distance. The world record is about 2.5 miles for a rifle shot.
So, a gun could now be fired more easily and its bullets travel further, but engineers and inventors were not finished with increasing the deadly performance of these explosive weapons. How about firing faster? In the 1880s, the British-built Maxim became the first powered machine gun. Firing at a murderous rate of 550 rounds a minute, this was the forerunner of the horrifically effective machine guns which cut a swathe of destruction throughout the First and Second World Wars.
The machine gun was very effective when used in the World Wars. It allowed one man to effectively command an army's worth of bullets. As the bullet is fired out, gas is released. The gas has to go somewhere. If used in a careful mechanism, that gas can push back the cartridge which holds the gunpowder, eject it, and that spring action that occurs pushes the next bullet into place and is ready for the hammer to whack the back of it in order to send the next bullet on. And you could have rounds of bullets that are 4,000 long, so you do not need to reload a magazine of say 12 to 24 bullets. You have essentially a relatively unlimited supply.
As nasty as the gun is, the quest to make it as deadly as possible has actually been partially responsible for our ability to explore the stars.
A useful spin-off from the invention of guns is that we understood ballistics better. We actually understood the trajectory of projectiles, we understood the trajectory in terms of how gravity works, even if we didn't have a complete equation for how gravity worked at the time. Back in the 13th century, gravity was just accepted, but not particularly well understood. However, we understood how to launch projectiles long distances, which also meant that when it comes to rockets and rocketry, we had that basis in order that we could start to put rockets higher and higher up into the Earth's atmosphere and eventually into orbit.
From changing the balance of power on the battlefield to helping put a man on the moon, the gun is truly a wicked invention. Can we explain why a bullet travels in a straight line by using a CD and a pencil? We're going to need a pencil, a CD, some coins of the same value, and some blue tack. To begin, we try balancing the pencil on its point. Unsurprisingly, the pencil falls down. Next, we take some blue tack and wrap it about 1/3 of the way up the pencil and secure the CD firmly in place. We spin the pencil. Like a spinning top, the pencil can now balance on its point because of something called angular momentum. To understand what is going on, we have to look at a bit of a formula. Angular momentum equals R times mv. The pencil stands up while spinning because we have used the CD to increase its radius, or R as written in the formula. M stands for mass or weight, and V equals velocity, or how fast we spin the pencil. Increasing any of these values creates a higher angular momentum, and the more stable and straight the spin. We can increase the pencil's angular momentum even further if we place coins on the CD equally spaced to increase its mass. And a bullet? A bullet leaves the barrel of the gun spinning at a mind-boggling 3,000 revolutions per minute. This creates an extremely high level of angular momentum, meaning the bullet travels in a very stable, straight line. Can we explain why a bullet travels in a straight line by using a CD and a pencil? Yes, we can. Wicked challenge smashed. From a small back garden to the slopes of Olympic venues, just how was the snowboard introduced?
Snowboards have quite a modern history. Not to say that somebody didn't slide down a slope on a plank at some point before, but it goes to a fella called Sherman Poppins in the States in 1965. And legend has it that Sherman tied two skis together.
Poppin then used the skis and began sliding around his back garden with his friends and family, much to the amusement of his children.
It caught on, and he spent the next few weeks actually going around buying cheap skis, water skis, and creating what he called the Snurfer, which is a brilliant name, but it was the first name of the snowboard.
From this, Poppin licensed the product to the Brunswick Corporation, who were and still are a popular manufacturing and marketing company. We then saw a huge increase in the use and purchase of the Snurfer, so much so that in the late 60s, competitions and races were held. Despite many other similar designs, Sherman Poppin is still regarded as the inventor of snowboards.
The problem for snowboarding in its early days, especially throughout the 70s and 80s, was the fact that a lot of ski runs wouldn't actually allow snowboarders in there. At the time, skiing was very much a kind of middle-class, slightly older pastime. In the early days, actually finding someone to do it was difficult.
As time passed and the popularity of the board increased, the majority of the bigger resorts had separate slopes for snowboarders. Now approximately 97% of all ski areas in North America and Europe allow snowboarding, with more than half including jumps, rails and half-pipes.
Snowboarding has now become, something as popular, equally popular to skiing. It's now an Olympic sport, and is an important part of youth culture across the globe.
We know how snowboards used to be made, but just how are they manufactured today? Duke have been making snowboards for around 5 years.
We're a small manufacturer with about 4 guys, making roughly about 6 snowboards a day on average.
To begin the creation of their bespoke boards, ash wood is brought into the factory and machined into a plank the size of a snowboard. This plank has the shape of a core drawn on using a template, and a craftsman uses a smaller bandsaw to roughly cut out the design. The roughly cut out core then has a thick template screwed on top. A router is used to trim the core to the exact size of the template, since the template protects the core from being trimmed too much. To give the board a durable edge to cut through the snow on, strong sidewalls are stuck onto the core in a special vise which holds the materials in position as the glue dries. After half an hour, the core is removed from the vise and put through a planer. This machine has a blade which cuts down anything passing through the machine that is too thick. To create the holes for the metal inserts that hold a rider's feet, another router tool is used, which drills a perfectly sized hole every time. There are 12 inserts for each foot, to make sure that any forces are spread out evenly. This decreases the chance of the board cracking, splitting or splintering under stress. Any art design can be put onto a snowboard, and all of the graphics are printed on site. The printed design is placed onto a template and clamped into place so it cannot move. Another router is used to trim away the border, leaving a printout that is exactly the size of the board. Next, wire edging is measured, cut to size and bent into the shape of the board. This makes it easier to clamp to the design and glue down. Meanwhile, the core is prepared for the layup process. First, hot glue is placed into the holes created earlier and the metal inserts pushed inside. A chisel is used to make sure the top of the holes are flush with no metal or glue sticking out. Plastic tips and tails are glued onto the respective ends of the core. These are flame treated to ensure they bond well with the glue and wooden core. The layup process begins by taking the cutout design from earlier and positioning it onto a metal sheet called a cassette, which is clamped down. Next, an epoxy glue made from 2 separate chemicals, which only become sticky once they've been combined, is mixed. This is stirred thoroughly and some is poured onto the back of the printed design. A piece of card is used to spread this out, making sure that the entire layer is coated before yellow strips are added to strengthen the board. Next, the fiberglass sheets are added and the wooden core is placed on top. This is the middle layer. The same materials are then laid above the core in a reverse order, with additional glue being added between every layer. Finally, the top graphic is placed on top, rubbed down and cleaned. The top half of the cassette is added to protect all of the layers together, and clamps are added to stop any layers from moving around as the board is positioned in the press. Slowly the airbag is inflated, which provides a strong force equally over the entire area of the board.
From there you put it in our heat press, which is under high pneumatic pressure and heat of about 70 degrees. It sits and cooks in there for about an hour.
It is open to reveal the board, which is checked for quality before holes are punched to reveal the metal inserts from earlier. To remove the excess glue and material from around the wooden core, a sharp bandsaw is used. The operator will first make a rough cut to remove weight from the board and make it easier to manoeuvre, then go back and trim the edges to the correct size. To create a slick surface that will smoothly slide down a slope, the bottom of the board is refined using 4 different belts. The first is a very rough sandpaper, and the last a smoother cork belt. The result is a far superior snowboarding surface. Small pits are drilled above the insert holes next to make threading the foot bindings much easier. The edge of the board undergoes one more sanding process using a hand sander. This makes sure no sharp edges have been created whilst refining the other edges of the board, or whilst using the belt sander. The insert holes are then cleaned using suction, and a simple screw thread inserted to make sure they are functional and tight. To finish the bottom of the board, it is polished with a soft wax in a process using 2 heated rollers. The first is a soft brush, which lavishly coats wax onto the board. The second is a tough buffer, which forces the wax into the microscopic imperfections within the board, creating the perfect surface to snowboard on. To finish the top of the board, the protective layer is peeled away, revealing a quality graphic. The board is now complete, so it can be sealed within protective plastic packaging and stored, ready for distribution.
We try not to stay static. Once we found what we've got, we don't want to just stick with that. We want to try and build on it, so we keep moving with the times, otherwise we'll get left behind.
One day soon, these boards will be traversing snow mountains all around the world. The snowboard. Truly a wicked invention. So, there you have it, a dash through the hidden history, super science and amazing manufacture of products that you use every day, but have never realised their amazing backgrounds. Cider, guns and snowboards. All wicked inventions.